Saurav Kumar. Welcome you all on behalf of MT School of Languages, MT University, Haryana, in this webinar on understanding language, few insights from Saussure and Chomsky. As we know, linguistics is the study of languages, and Saussure and Chomsky are the two greatest pillars of modern day linguistics. Saussure, on one hand, he introduces the ideas of um, uh, structural linguistics, long and parole, signifier, signifiant, as we say in French. And on other side, Chomsky introduced the idea of cognitive science and universal grammar. So this is going to be a very interesting topic, how to understand language through linguistics. And to enlighten us more on this topic, we are fortunate to have Dr. Amitav Vikram Dwivedi, who is University Faculty of Linguistics and heading the School of Languages and Literature at Sri Mata Vaishno Devi University. His research interests include language documentation, writing descriptive grammars, and the presentation of rare and endangered languages in South Asia. The National Digital Library of India, NDLI, which is run by MHRD, features his 11 lectures in the public domain. Also, the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger refers to his two works on the Bhadravahi language at its official website. His published books is found in the libraries of University of Stanford and Princeton. He has contributed numerous papers to many science citation index and Scopus journals, and contributed to more than 150 research chapters to knowledge resources, chiefly UNESCO, and to encyclopedias published by Springer Nature, Sage, Roman, and Littlefield, and many more reputed publications. He has also been a co-director for a research project entitled A Comprehensive Study of Culture, Philosophy, Literature, and Language, sanctioned by the Indian Council of Social Science Research, ICSSR. Most recently, one of his poems, Mother, has been published as a prologue to Motherhood and War, International Perspective, a book published by Palgrave Macmillan Press. So he is a very resourceful person, and he is going to tell us more about this topic. But before coming to the main presentation, I would like to invite uh, our Dean, Professor UN Singh sir, to introduce the topic of the webinar, today's webinar. He is a reputed academician and holds a good command on various topics, various areas of study, and linguistics is one of his most favorite areas. So he would be the right person to introduce this topic today. So please, sir, please introduce the topic, and then we will further go for the presentation. Sir.
Thank you, Saurabh. I will be very brief. And we particularly very happy that we have Dr. Dwivedi today with us. And when 30 of us were creating the World Atlas for Endangered Languages, I was looking for the right kind of references, people who worked on those smaller languages, languages which many people thought did not matter. And Dr. Dwivedi's work was very important for us at that time to refer to, which is already mentioned by Saurabh. And today, the topic that he has chosen is of great interest to both literary scholars, semioticians, structural anthropologists, as well as linguists. And all of us know that various disciplines have benefited from both Chomsky and Saussure. Saussure has been a father figure in so many ways for many disciplines. So has Chomsky been. I mean, Chomsky is known as a political scientist and as a cognitive scientist as much as he's known as a linguist. So that's something which is very crucial. And we know that what linguistics was before Saussure came in and what linguistics became after he came in, there was a big difference between the two. And it is so fortunate for those students, 50 plus students who could be in his class in the University of Geneva, who finally created the book that he never wrote, but the book that made him famous, Cours de linguistique générale, the course in general linguistics. And let us hear from the speaker of today more about Saussure, about Chomsky. We are all aware because he's more close to us. Even now during COVID time, the moment you open up, YouTube, you find Chomsky talking about the American politics, the politics of the
I think we have lost the connection with Dr. Professor Yuan Singh sir. So uh, I think we should proceed with the presentation of the day. So I would like to invite Dr. Amitav Vikram Dwivedi to please continue with your presentation, and sir will join later, and we will take his remarks at the end of your presentation.
Yeah,
Wait. I think, sir.
yeah, the power had gone off, so please go ahead. Please start.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
thank you, Professor Singh, Dr. Saurabh, and the team for organizing this lecture. I'm directly coming to my presentation without wasting any time. I'm sharing the slides so that you'll be able to see my presentation. Uh, the topic I'm dealing today is understanding language. A few insights from Saussure and Chomsky. And
Sir, Vikram, Amitav sir, I'm sorry I'm interrupting you this time, but I have to make one small announcement to
yes.
participants and other participants. So please, if you have any question, please send those questions to Q&A section, rather putting it in chat box. That would be easier for us to pick those questions for the question answer session. Thank you. Sir, please continue with your presentation.
Okay.
Sorry.
So as you know that I'm dealing with understanding language, a few insights from Saussure and Chomsky. But before I start, let me give you this picture of language, how this entire language thing becomes comprehensible to us. So you can think of human mind as a sophisticated translating machine, because when someone, let's say speaker A speaks to speaker B, then basically speaker A is producing sound waves, and those sound waves are actually translated into uh, speech sounds, because the speaker B take help of auditory apparatus, and they are translated into speech sound, and those speech sounds are recognized as either in the form of words or in the form of phrases or in the form of sentences. And then these words, phrases and sentences, they are actually understood as meaningful thoughts and ideas. So basically this entire thing of understanding language and how sound waves, they finally they become meaningful thoughts and idea, is basically a very sophisticated translating machine. It's the metaphor I'm using for a human mind that is basically translating sound waves to meaningful thoughts. So this is basically, this thing happens when we interact with each other, and this entire language thing comes into being. Now, starting with the first linguist, and he's also known as father of modern linguists, and we use this term father, and why we use this term father, that is also an interesting thing. Because we find in his work course in general linguistics, there is a philosophy of language, and not only a philosophy of language, but there is a paradigm shift what other people during that period they were doing. So now we use the term linguist, but during that time there was a term like a philologist. So they were philologists and they were working on basically the historical linguistic tradition, and they were comparing how language, like two languages, what is their relation between them, or how one form is evolved from other. So basically this comparison thing was going on. But though Saussure also worked in this tradition when he was teaching Sanskrit language and historical linguistics for 10 years. But in 1911, uh, when he realized that this is not the way through which we can know the essence of language. So this paradigm shift is basically from this diachronic thing to synchronic thing. We will discuss this diachronic and synchronic thing is also in detail, but there is a book after his name. Obviously, he has not written any book like this, but this book was published uh, under his name, and that is Course in Journal Linguist. That is again a significant book, and basically this book it deals with the system of language, how we perceive this language, what is this language. So basically it's like a philosophy of language, we can consider this entire text is. And when we talk about this paradigm shift from diachronic to synchronic, you can notice that there is one common Greek root, that is chronos, that is time, and you have this preposition dia, that is across time, that is diachronic, and syn, that is with. So with time is basically synchronic. You can also understand diachronic study as a historical linguistics, and synchronic as a as a as a as a single point of time you are considering, you are looking at a language. So this is how uh, Saussure's work became important, and the linguistics as a discipline emerged as an independent discipline. Linguistics has emerged. So that's why uh, we say that okay, Saussure is the father of modern linguistics, because this entire theory that is associated with the language, people are starting looking at language from a new point of view rather than simply a comparison and other things. So uh, how Saussure looks at language, that is also important. And at one place Saussure says that speech is primary and writing secondary. Now what do we mean by this, like when Saussure says that speech is primary and writing secondary? So the writing sign basically like signifies spoken sign. You can consider like the first thing is the spoken sign, and we have this system of writing sign, but basically they also signifies what we have spoken. So in a Derridian sense, we can say a sign is a sign of another sign, or writing is a sign of a sign. That way we can also understand this thing, that why speech is primary and writing secondary. And another thing, at one place, Saussure also mentioned this phrase, tyranny of writing. And what does he mean by this thing, a tyranny of writing? So basically, meaning a conservative force. He talks about a conservative force in writing that actually slowed down the constant modifications naturally occurring in spoken languages. So this is how like something is more natural and something is like imposed on us. That's why in that way we can also say a speech is primary and writing secondary, and like one is obstructing the natural flow uh, of the one. That's why in that sense we can also say speech is primary and writing secondary. So there are 2-3 ways through which we can analyze this phrase, like why speech is primary and why writing secondary. And Saussure says that language is a system of signs. Now, this is quite interesting, like when he says language is a system of sign, because this concept of sign is very important in Saussure. Because when Saussure talks about sign, Saussure is not talking about any sign. Saussure is very specific and he talks about only linguistic sign. And again, there is there is like, what is the linguistic sign? That is again uh, a very good question. And basically, linguistic signs are building blocks we use to communicate our thoughts. So if we look at Saussure's work closely, then we find that Saussure gave preference to morphology than phonetics, because the meaning of phonetics that we use today as a scientific study of human sound, that's not the meaning they were using during that time. During that time, phonetics, the meaning of phonetics was like historical phonetics, like comparing two different periods, the sounds that were used in those different periods. And moreover, the problem with phonetics is of form and sense as well, because Saussure says like there is no difference between form and sense. But when we look at let's say a sound segment, then there is a possibility that there is no sense associated with that individual sound unit. So that's why you need to understand that when Saussure says language as a system of sign, then Saussure is basically talking about linguistic sign and the morphological sign basically. Now, the another thing is that language is the psychological property of human beings. So we know with this word psychology and psychological as an adjective, it is used here, that it is related to mind. And if you want to know the essence of Saussure's work, then these three statements very nicely encapsulate what Saussure says. First thing is language is a system of systems. Second is language is a system of differences. And the third one is the relationship between signifier and signified is arbitrary. We will discuss all three. When we talk about language is a system of systems, you can see that the minimal meaningful sound unit is a phoneme, and when we have more than one phoneme, they combine together, then we have morphemes, then we can have a single morpheme, we can have two morphemes, they can combine here. So we have a phoneme b, then we have a morpheme bat, and then bats. So two morphemes, they combine, they make word. Then if we have more than one word, they combine, they make phrase. Then we have more words, they can make a clause, and the clause can make a sentence. So this is like we have a system like phonetics and phonology is like one system, morphology is another system. Then you have this the syntax, this another system. So when we say that language is a system of systems, so it's like all these systems, they are interrelated to each other. And when we talk about that language is a system of differences, then when we look at the philosophical position of Saussure, we find that everything is meaningful because of the dichotomy, everything is meaningful because of the opposition. So opposition becomes quite important. And there is a synchronicity, there is dichronicity that we have, so they are also in opposition forces. Then we have this Lang and Parole, they are also in opposite. Fine. So we find that language is a system of systems, and then language and each system gets meaning because there are differences in the system. So differences are important to make something meaningful in a way we can understand. Now we move further. Then this concept of sign that Saussure basically talks about linguistic sign, unlike Charles Sanders Peirce, like for Peirce, everything is a sign that is interpreted by someone that becomes a sign. But here only linguistic sign and preferably a morphological sign. Starting from morphological sign is a linguistic sign. Now this diagram, this model of sign is quite popular, and you need to look at this thing because this diagram says many things. First thing, if you look at this diagram, signified takes precedence over signifier. So that means we are saying, or what Saussure is saying, that sense precedes sound. So it's like first we get into the sense and then we get into the sound. That is one thing. And we need to remember one another thing, that both signifier and signified are psychological entities, because in letter text in letter books we find signified is related to the mental concept and signifier is related to the material concept. So that translation is also there, but Basically, Saussure means that both signifier and signified, they are psychological entities. Both are this conceptual part that is there. And in the second figure, you see the bubbles, and why these bubbles are there, because they both these things like the sound pattern that also occurs in our mind, and the concept that also occurs in our mind. But concept precedes sound. That is more important. Like it's not like sound. It's like sound precedes concept, but concepts precedes sounds. That becomes more important for us. And we move further, we find that these signs, like how these signs becomes meaningful. So there's a relation is like the relation between one sign and another sign is quite important. And at one place, Saussure says that everything depends upon relations. So now, as you can see in the figure, that sign 1 interacts with sign 2, sign 2 interacts with sign 3, and likewise. And there is a relation, like they are interacting with each other, and because of that interaction, uh, sign becomes meaningful. So the bottom line is that a sign has no inherent value in it itself. So it becomes meaningful when it interacts. If it doesn't interact, then there is no value, inherent value in a sign. That is again one important thing that you find in the Saussure's philosophy of language. And there is one metaphor Saussure used, that is a piece of paper. And what Saussure says, that signifier and signified are like two sides of a piece of paper. So what is the definition of a paper? When it has both sides. So we can't say like if there is one side and it is a piece of paper. So similarly, like inherent like thing in a piece of paper is both the sides. And similarly, if something is a sign, then a sign must have a signifier and signified inherent in that. Otherwise, a sign is not a sign. And this is like when we say like one sign interacts with other sign, then this like the opposition between phonetics and morphology becomes also important. And Saussure opposed phonetics to morphology. Phonetics could study forms, but the constituent of a lang were linguistic sign. That is the indissociable union of an acoustic image and a concept. This is quite important and interesting. I find like even like when we study sounds, and if we study sounds in isolation, then they are simply form. There is no concept associated with them. But when it comes to morphology, even the morphology like run, and I say running, and I say ing, then ing has this aspectual concept of progression that is associated with it. Or when I say walk and when I say walked, then ed, that is aspectual concept of something that has been done. So that this perfective aspect is at least associated with this morpheme ed. So this logic is I find quite fascinating that that morphology is preferred over phonetics. That I find quite interesting in Saussure. Then Saussure also talks about semantic relations, and in that semantic relation, again, like this opposition and the dichotomy works, and this dichotomy works on two axes. Again, this two axes is like a concept, an abstract thing. You need to think of like a meaningful thing, a meaningfulness is happening on two axes, and those axes like x and y axis you can assume. And like on at one axis there is paradigmatic relationship, and another axis there is syntagmatic relationship. So basically, what is paradigmatic and syntagmatic? Paradigmatic relationship is basically contrast and substitution. This relationship is a relationship of contrast and substitution. And when you talk about syntagmatic relationship, it is combination and co-occurrence restriction. Now let me tell you like how this thing happens at sound level. First, let me tell you like there are three words: cat, sat, and mat. Like these words are basically similar except the first sound. So this is a paradigmatic relationship like of contrast, like ka contrast with sa sound, sa contrast with ma sound. Or you can consider like they are substituting each other, and once they're substituting each other, or when they are in the like this binary opposition, then they become meaningful. So here like how sign interacts with other sign and becomes meaningful, that you can understand. Of sign with other sign can be understood when you look at this syntagmatic relationship. So syntagmatic is not only the combination but co-occurrence restriction. So at syntactic level, you find, for example, the cat sat on the mat. Now this is a syntax, like you have a subject, you have verb, and you have this preposition phrase on the mat. Now here you can't reverse the order, you can't say cat the, or you can't say on sat. So this is like, there is a combination of words, but but on that combination there is a co-occurrence restriction, and when we want to make something meaningful, we need to follow this syntagmatic relation in order to make this meaningful. But in this syntax, like I can change the cat with the dog. So I can say the dog sat on the mat, or I can say the cat sat on the couch. So this relationship between mat and couch, that is of paradigmatic, because it is of contrast and substantive. At the same level, once someone writes poetry, then these syntagmatic relationships, they also come into being. For example, like the sun is shining bright, this is a lovely sight. So I know, like, okay, my word final, the word final word is like, the ending word is bright. So I need to think of a similar rhyming word. So it's a lovely sight. So bright and sight in this like poetic line, in this rhyme scheme, they are also in paradigmatic relationship. So this Saussure talks about syntagmatic and paradigmatic relationship. Then Saussure also talks about Lalang and La Parole. And Lang is basically a system he talks about. And so Lang describes the social consensus of how science are applied. So society becomes also important. They have a consensus of certain science. Like, okay, from now onwards, we will say this thing, that. So that type of consensus we have related to science and how they are to be applied. For example, like different languages, they have different type of word orders, or like different objects are named differently. So this is because of this social consensus that we have and how we should apply science to them. And Parole described the physical manifestation of Lang. So like the way I speak or the way you write, that is again the physical manifestation of basically the Lang. So Lang is basically the system, but if you want to say like, okay, I have mastered a system, then people will ask, okay, show me your system. How can you show? Through instantiation. And what is that instantiation? Either you speak, if you say, okay, I'm a very good speaker, people will say, okay, demonstrate. So demonstration is basically Parole. So physical manifestation, either through writing, you can show, okay, I know a language, or through speaking, you can say, uh, you know a language. And Saussure also says like language is independent of individual users. So we are talking about social consensus at one place, but also we are talking about that language is not one man's property. So it's like independent to, as a system, as an abstract thing, it is independent to individual users. So there is like a fine table. I've shown that Lang is abstract and Parole is concrete. Then Lang deals with the principles, and Parole deals with the instantiation of that. It is a system and it is individual user. So this is the difference. And the analogy of chess is quite popular when we talk about this Lang and Parole. Now I move from what Saussure said to what Chomsky thinks about language. So Chomsky talks about this nativism, fine, linguistic nativism. But we find that Chomsky, he's not the first to talk about these things. So certain reference we find in Charles Darwin's chapter 2, The Descent of Man in Origin of Species. And Charles Darwin suggested that human beings, they have an instinct to learn language. So this is like this instinctual thing. Language is instinctual thing, is not new or something that is directly credited to Chomsky, because though this term like innateness hypothesis is quite associated with Chomsky, but it was actually Hilary Putnam who initiated or coined this innate net hypothesis. And what is basically this innate net hypothesis? This is, it talks about a linguistic theory of language acquisition. So when we talk about like how language is acquired so quickly by a child in 2-3 years, so that means like it entails that, okay, there must be some knowledge about language exists in human at birth. So the credit of coining this innate net hypothesis is to Hilary, but later on, like Chomsky made this entire thing possible. But at the same time, there is a problem with this entire innate net hypothesis, and in the work of Deacon, the symbolic species, we find that Terence Deacon rejects Chomsky's innate net hypothesis and claims that human language has evolved to be acquired easily by immature mind. Because we have this a critical period hypothesis that, okay, there is a bifurcation of left hemisphere and right hemisphere, and after that it becomes difficult for a person to acquire a new language. So person can only learn a language, person cannot acquire a language. But contrary to that argument, Terence says that, okay, language is like evolved in such a manner that it can only be acquired by immature minds. So once you get mature, then it becomes difficult for you to acquire a language. So this is again quite an interesting argument against this innate net hypothesis that I found. And as Saussure is famous for his general linguistics and known as the father of modern linguistics, we have again one more father figure, that is the father of generative grammar. And there we saw a paradigm shift from dichronicity to synchronicity, and here again we have a paradigm shift from like structuralism to generative. So we have this paradigm shift, and because of this paradigm shift, we call them a father figure. It is not out of our like love or any other thing, but because they made some important paradigm shift, that's why we call them the father of generative grammar or father of modern linguistics. So what is basically this generative grammar do? Like, so it describes and explains. What it describes and explains? Something that is in my mind. Something that is in my mind, that is my cognitive properties. Those properties are in my mind. I cannot show you. Neither a finest surgeon can show you what are the cognitive properties I have. So what is the answer? What is the answer? You need to show it through some theoretical model. And what is the theoretical model? This generative grammar is the model that shows, okay, you know a language, and this is the representation of the language, how the language is structured in your brain. So this is basically an abstract thing, a theoretical thing. And Chomsky at one place says that linguistics is a cognitive science, because we can show something that is in our mind, that is the finest neurosurgeon cannot show. But through linguistics, through this generative grammar model, we can at least explain, look, this way, this entire language is structured in your brain. And this is the famous work, Syntactic Structure, published in 1957, where he talks about various transformation. And that is the starting point of basically the generative grammar that we have. Now, we look at this Chomsky's view on language, and Chomsky also uses like capital L and the small l with language. So when Chomsky talks about capital L, then Chomsky is talking about basically a system. And when Chomsky talks about small l, then basically Chomsky is talking about the instantiation. So again, this long parole type of thing, like I have a long, I want to show the demonstration, then parole is the demonstration. So similarly, I have this L, capital L language as a system, and I want to show you. You ask me, okay, show me your language. I speak or I write something. So that is instantiation of that system that we have. And at some places, it is also used as I language. I is again this internal, and then E is external. So these are also this L, capital L is also at some places is used as I language and E language that we have. Then Chomsky also talks about linguistic competence and linguistic performance. Now, these two concepts are also there. These concepts are quite interesting when we talk about this competence thing. When we talk about this linguistic competence, basically it is a system of linguistic knowledge possessed by native speaker of a language. So competence is something, a system that you have, and instantiation of that system is like your performance, the way a language system is used in communication. So how can you use it through orally or in a written mode? That's up to you how you perform it. But certain other things are also associated with linguistic competence and performance. That is, Chomsky talks about an ideal speaker listener. So linguistic theory is primarily concerned with an ideal speaker listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors. So basically all these things like the limitations, they are related to performance, linguistic performance. And when we need to posit a theory, we need to think of that there is an ideal speaker listener, and these ideal speaker, these type of ideal speakers, they live in a completely homogeneous speech community. So this is basically again a hypothetical thing. But why do we need this hypothetical thing? Because I am positing a theory. Chomsky is positing a theory. In order to posit a theory, we need to take certain things. We need to take certain things that is to be directed clearly. That okay, we are positing this theory, but provided we have an ideal speaker listener, that is one thing, and second thing, they are completely living in homogeneous community. Though it doesn't happen, like no one lives in a completely homogeneous community and no one is an ideal speaker listener. But because Chomsky was positing a theory, that's why he needed to take care of this thing, and that's why he phrased this entire thing. So as we know that competence, it talks about this unconscious and innate knowledge of linguistic rules and the performance that describes this observable use of language that we have. Then these two concepts that are quite interesting and that are associated with the Chomsky's view of language, that Chomsky says that grammar is not only important, but we need to take care of appropriateness. And this is much quoted example that we have: colorless green ideas sleep furiously. If you look at this sentence, you find that this is a perfectly grammatical sentence where you have this modifier colorless is modifying the adjective green. And then this adjective green is again modifying ideas, that is noun, and then verb is sleep and the furiously. So it's like a perfectly grammatical sentence, but something is, a color cannot be colorless, and we can sleep, but we can sleep peacefully, we can sleep calmly, we can sleep nicely, but we can't sleep furiously. And then even if we have ideas, then ideas can't sleep. So this entire thing is not meaningful. This entire thing is not appropriate, though it is perfectly grammatical. So what Chomsky says, like something is meaningful when the thing is appropriate as well as the grammatical. So these things that are also associated with the language aspect that we have. Like this is basically not related to this Chomsky and Saussure, but this couple of slides like I have made, like we have this dichotomy and this problem of preference of language versus dialect. And there is one social linguist, Marx Weinrich, and he says that a language is a dialect with an army and navy. So basically he says like this army and navy is basically a metaphor, and metaphor for power, metaphor for political and social influence that we have. So basically there is no such difference between language and dialect, and most of the time like we don't use them. We use in fact like major or minor language, but previously these things were quite contested, and that's why I have taken this thing. And again, as a linguist, like it's not our work to say what is right, what is wrong, use this language, use that language. So we, as a linguist, we work as in the descriptive linguistic tradition. We don't work as a language purist. We don't work as a language police, and we want to guide or we want instruct meaning to language, but we simply observe language, and we try to explain it. That is basically the work of a linguist. So certain policies that are associated with language, and as you know, like some people say like this language is primitive, this language is advanced, this language has grammar, this language has no grammar, this language is beautiful, this language is like sounds ugly. All those things are, so these all things are language fallacies. There is no such thing like this. So I end my session with this. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Amitabhji, for your very beautiful and informative and interesting presentation. And it reminded me of my master's classes when I was taking linguistics as one of my courses, and we were studying Saussure, and we started with a structural linguistics with a signifié, signifiant, la signe linguistique, because I did my master's in French. So it was signe linguistique, and the word you used signifiant and signifier. So that we used to say signifiant and signifié. So more or less the examples were the same. We used to give the example of tree, and the picture which you showed in your slide. So it was again revisiting those linguistics classes for me. Thank you for your presentation. Now I would like to invite our Dean Professor UN Singh sir to give his valuable remarks on this presentation and on this topic, and to initiate the Q&A session uh, further. Sir?
Thank you. I hope you are able to hear me.
Yes, sir.
The interesting point that was made by Dr. Vivedi is that there is a parallel between what Chomsky had done and what Saussure had done. As we all know, during pre-Saussurean period, the main thrust was on comparative philology. And that was something which later on became a part of historical linguistics. And the most important point of debate at that particular point was, which are the languages that are related to the other languages? What are the language families that exist in the world? How can we define, describe, and categorize, and classify, and characterize linguistic families? These were the main questions those days. Whereas somebody like Saussure, who in a school had already learned Sanskrit, Latin, German, French, and Greek, had come to his college to do linguistics and philology. From there, being from the tradition of comparative studies, he evolved as a modern thinker, where he has made a very interesting assumption in his theory, which Dr. Dwivedi has mentioned, that although language keeps on changing from time to time and from person to person, the assumption is that it doesn't change. So imagine it doesn't change. If it doesn't change, then how do you describe it? So the dilemma of the theoretician, that A, language keeps on changing, and B, you have to describe the language. So if something keeps on constantly changing, how do you describe the language? That dilemma was resolved by him in a very interesting manner through his theoretical foundations. Similar is the case with Chomsky. The generativity part of it, that language is not something which is purely imprinted on a tabula rasa, on a blank slate, on a blank mind. That it is something which explains the fact that even the most unintelligent person is able to speak, understand, process a perfectly intelligent sentence. So that is something which is a very new idea at that particular point of time. So in a way, both had revolutionized our thinking. Of course, we did find a lot of defects in Chomsky or in Saussure toward later on. And nothing stopped. I mean, the theoretical linguistics did not stop at them. But at the same time, they really had initiated very interesting debates during their time. And both had started very young. This is also another very interesting point, that their formative ideas came up when they were very young. So that's interesting. But anyway, this was a very good exposure to somebody who is partly initiated into language studies and partly not, from this point of view. So thank you, Dr. Dwivedi, for picking it up, presenting these things very nicely. I hope there are questions people will be asking. And over to you, Dr. Salat.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Dwivedi, as such, we have not many questions here, but there are some remarks we have got from our participants. Dr. Krati Bhomia has given he thanks you for a informative and interesting session. And there is maybe a question or kind of comment on from Subhash Kumar. He wants your view, that he says that from his point of view, Lalang signifies language and la parole signifies speech. Is he right, or So could you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, that's the quite interesting. Basically, we have these three terms. Language. Language is one term that is used in Saussure's work. The Lalang and La Parole that is also there. So these three are used. And when I was reading, basically, okay, because I don't know French, so I was reading the translation of this entire Saussure's philosophy of language, and I found like there is a problem of homonyms in there. So sometimes language is for the language, and sometimes Lalang is also used for the language. Uh, in the translation, or in the French, let's say in the French. So it is up to the translator basically to find out like when Lalang is a system and when Lalang is used as a language. So basically these words sometimes, like, because they are homophonous in French language, fine, or sometimes homographs you can say, or we can use the term homonyms in order to avoid this dichotomy between homophones and homograph. So these words are used interchangeably, and that's why the work of the translator, it becomes so difficult. But obviously Lalang is basically the system, and this Lalang, the language that we talk about, this language is basically for the language he talks about, and the instantiation of this language, like either in the form of speech, or either in the form of, because Saussure says speech is primary and writing secondary. So you can, what you said, la parole signifies speech. So there is no, I don't find it's any problem in that. Parole signifies speech, because Saussure says speech is primary, and talks about all the time. He talks about the speech in his work, and he doesn't take care of this writing thing. So there is no problem in that, and I can sense that sometimes language and Lalang, they can be used interchangeably, either sometimes in the form of a language or sometimes in the form of a system. So so this is the thing.
Okay. What I remember, to add to your point, because what I remember from my linguistics classes, long and langage, there are two words which you used here. So long, we used to use it for language, what we speak, and langage was a umbrella term which we use for language, as well as gestures and many other things, and symbols also, which are not the part of your speaking, but you understand they have some meaning. So that is what I remember from my classes long ago. So thank you for that. And now there is a question from Shivam. So he has put the question: how these linguistic developments influence the study of literature text? Are there books which elaborate the influence of these theories on reading of a literary text regarding the understanding of text, with concrete examples, if you have, if you can elaborate on that?
Okay. The thing is, if you ask this question, like what comes first, language or literature, then the obvious answer is language comes first. So language is responsible for literature, and I sometimes find it very funny when some literature people, they say okay, I am not into language, but I am into literature. So I find it very funny. How is it possible that without going into the language you can read literature? Because we are not reading literature, we are actually studying literature, because we are academicians. We are not reading it for simply pleasure. Now to your question, how linguistic becomes important. How linguistics, not only this linguistic, this entire thing is a philosophy of language. So this, if you internalize this entire philosophy of language, you can use it anywhere, at any text that you can use it. So it's not like the sign, signifier, and signified is only to the linguistic class. When you find some sign, signifier, and signified, and sometimes when you look at Barth's mythology, you find three layers of signification in there. So signification 1, signification 2, signification 3. So if you find multiplicity of meaning, for example, Bhaktin talks about polyphonic. So all these things are not occurring in isolation. When Bhaktin says polyphonic, then poly means many and phonic means sound. So many sounds he talks about. So basically all these literary theories, they have taken something from linguistics. If you look at Julia Kristeva, like this, Julia Kristeva was a linguist, fine, and then later on she developed this entire theory of subjectivity, fine, textuality. That thing is there. So you can't look at things in isolation. You need to make a holistic picture that how one thing is related to other. But obviously, when you are analyzing a particular work, you need to take theoretical lens. Now, I compare this theoretical lens like a binocular. So what is the use of theoretical lens? Like if you are standing in New Delhi and if I give you a binocular and if I say that, okay, can you see someone in New York? You say, no, I cannot see anything in New York because I'm using this binocular. So theoretical lens are also different types of binoculars. Certain theoretical lens, they are capable of seeing very far. Certain theoretical lens, they have limitations. They can't see that far. So you need, once you are analyzing a text, you need to choose your binoculars very carefully, your theoretical lens, like which theoretical lens I am using, which is appropriate for analyzing this particular work. And if that is otherwise tiger burning bright in the forest in the night, you say like it is a digestion problem. Someone has consumed the meat of tiger and the indigestion has occurred in the, so that's why person is saying tiger burning bright. So it is basically burning in the stomach. So that analysis we want to go. So you need to select correct binoculars in order to analyze a text. And if you find that linguistic model or Saussurean model is good, then go for it. If you find no, Saussurean model is limited, I want to go for Persian model of sign, because Persian and Saussure, they were contemporary. One was working in Switzerland, another one was working in US. So you find like, okay, Persian model is more elaborate, then you can go for that. So that is up to you. So how you use them, because if you have a tool, then you also need to know how to use that tool.
Okay, good. Dr. Dwivedi, there is another question is asked by Sandeep Kumar Barai, and he is asking how Saussure is related to structuralism.
Okay, how Saussure is related to, because it is related in a manner that literary theorists who developed this structuralism, basically they had drawn from his model, his language models. So that's why like he is related to structuralism in a way, because structuralism generally we consider is a literary movement, like to analyze the structure of the text. And when we analyze the structure of text, that means we are talking about form and sense. Basically Saussure was against this opposition. There is no opposition between form and sense. But when we talk about structuralism, since it's a literary movement and it is applied to literary text, then we need to realize, okay, this is one thing is a form, and how this form is translated into sense, how this form is translated into meaningful thought. So that's why it is related to, like it's like you can consider the impetus or the philosophical theory or the background is of Saussure, and later on they developed this entire thing in the form of structuralism.
Okay, so Dr. Dwivedi, there is a question from my side. How do you say that what are the limitations you see in the theory of Saussure, like structural linguistics, where it stops and where this cognitive science of Chomsky starts? Where is the gap, or where is the overlap of in these two theories? Can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it's like basically the genetics. Like when we talk about Chomsky, then we say like, okay, we have a language gene. That means like, as Pinker says, like we have a language gene. Stephen Pinker talks about this language gene. But this sort of thing, like language is innate, or language is inscribed, fine, in the brain, fine, or like we already like when we are born, then already we have certain amount of language that is already there in us, like it's described in UG, like the principles that are already there, then the parametric variations that are associated with that. So that thing is basically missing in Saussure's theory. And why it is missing, that I also tell you, because of this the biologists that were there. So he was also limited to the biologists, their findings and what they are saying. So during that time, no neurosurgeon, no biologist, like no cognitivist was talking about, okay, language is innate. But in Chomsky time, many people, they were talking about, no, we have a language gene. We found out it is Fox, like, so Fox 18, I think, what's the language gene they discovered. So they said, no, we have a language gene. So once we have this impetus, okay, we have a language gene, okay, let's theorize this thing. So during that time, there was no evidence. So he was not theorizing that thing. So with that limited, and you think of like he gave this entire philosophy of language in 1911. Previously, he was also working like a philologist. He was comparing two languages. He was teaching Sanskrit, and he was satisfied with that type of life. But he later on realized, okay, this is not the way to know the essence of language. This is not the way to understand language as a system. Then in 1911, he started working on altogether different thing. And he said, no, language is basically not this. This is not the work of a linguist to compare and they find out like this is that. But we need to build a philosophy of language that is more important. So this is like basically the missing point in Saussure. Like Saussure never talks about like that language gene or like language. Like we are already born with something that is there in our brain related to language.
Okay, thank you. There are now some more questions are pouring in, but the question is we are short of time. We have to finish this session in few minutes. So I'm sorry if I am not able to take some of your questions. I would like to invite our Dean Professor Yuan Singh sir for a vote of thanks and to conclude the session.
Well, thank you, Saurabh. I think the people who are got initiated into this discussion without the background of linguistics, they benefited perhaps the most.
Yes.
Those who had somewhere some linguistics background, they also were able to clear some of the confusions. And for all these inputs, let us thank Dr. Dwivedi from our heart, from the MIT School of Languages. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr.
Thank you, sir. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Amit Vikram Dwivedi ji for the discussion. And I would like to thank Professor Yuan Singh sir for giving me this opportunity to organize this webinar today. And same time, I would like to thank our technical support, without whom we could not have done anything. So Mr. Bakshi and his team was very helpful to us to organize this program. And my colleagues, they have been very supportive to me, and all the participants who have participated. And if I again apologize if I could not put your questions here. So I thank all the participants to participate in this webinar and making it a success. Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Amit ji.